In the summer of 1483, unease was in the air across England. Mystery surrounded the fate of the country's young king, Edward V. For a time, Edward's uncle, Richard Duke of Gloucester, kept up appearances in his role as the protector of the king, but this was purely for show. Once Richard had removed those who may pose a threat to him and his bid for power, he grew in confidence. He started to wear clothes of purple, the colour of royalty, rather than the more sombre robes he had worn since the death of his brother, King Edward IV, in April of that year. Richard also began to act more and more like a king by throwing extravagant feasts and parading himself very publicly through the streets of London. No doubt he hoped to win support for when he, now inevitably, attempted to take the crown. However, Richard's public appearances were met with, at best, indifference. Whilst people at the time couldn't be certain as to what happened to Edward V, as indeed we aren't even to this day, they could, like us, form a pretty good guess as to what had occurred in the Tower of London, where Edward V and his 10-year-old brother, Richard Duke of York, were last seen when Richard III was crowned king in July 1483. Richard had claimed that Edward V and his brother were illegitimate due to a marriage agreement their father had made before his eventual marriage to their mother Elizabeth Woodville. Another claim even circulated that Edward IV himself was illegitimate, as he had been, according to Richard's supporters, born in adultery. These same supporters claimed Edward bore no resemblance to his and Richard's father, whilst Richard resembled their father greatly. Of course, if some really did hold these beliefs, they were standing on very flimsy ground. If one looks at several portraits of both Edward IV and Richard III, it is not difficult to see a family resemblance. As for the marriage contract that Edward IV had made prior to his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, to a woman named Eleanor Talbot, it is hard to say for sure what had really happened, but was it really enough to declare Edward V unfit to rule? And there is evidence to suggest that this particular claim was spurious. Richard gathered all the nobles in London. These nobles were ordered to bring only a few retainers with them. It was clear that the Duke of Gloucester wanted to take as many precautions as possible before having himself declared king. He certainly didn't need too many armed men in the capital, at least not for the time being. Richard sent the Duke of Buckingham to the House of Lords, where he would make the case of Edward V being deprived of the right to rule because of his supposed illegitimacy. Buckingham repeated the claim that Edward IV had been betrothed to Eleanor Talbot. According to Dominic Mancini, Buckingham claimed that Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, was instrumental in the arrangement of this agreement with Eleanor, but Warwick, at the time of Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, was in France, hoping to arrange a marriage for Edward to a foreign princess. Discussions with Eleanor may have taken place, but it seems unlikely that Edward IV or Warwick believed that this arrangement was binding. After the Woodville marriage, Warwick, who had been left high and dry on the continent by the king, began to plot against him. Buckingham also threw slander at Elizabeth Woodville, who had definitely been married before her match with Edward IV, to a man named Sir John Grey. Implications were made that Elizabeth had been almost treated as a mistress rather than a wife by Edward. It was true that Edward, like many medieval kings, was often guilty of lust, and he certainly lusted after Elizabeth. But Elizabeth had retained her dignity and composure despite the king's overbearing advances, and it was this that encouraged Edward to make her his queen. There is no hard evidence to support the claim that the children born to this royal couple were in fact illegitimate. There was another potential obstacle for Richard to overcome, and that came in the shape of another nephew, also called Edward. This Edward was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, a brother of Edward IV and Richard III. George was somewhat of an odd fellow who had been a particularly bothersome problem for Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses, until he finally went too far and was executed inside the walls of the Tower of London, allegedly in a barrel of Malmsey wine. But as Clarence had been charged with treason, that made the case for disinheriting Edward much easier, and this unfortunate young boy would spend most of his life as a prisoner until his execution in 1499 on the orders of Henry VII. Parliament now had a decision to make. The case had been put to them for making the Duke of Gloucester king in place of Edward V. There would have been those who would have been highly sceptical of Buckingham's words, and perhaps racked with guilt that the young Edward V, still held firmly under lock and key, had no opportunity to defend himself. The men inside Parliament also knew that Edward's future would be cast into terrible doubt should they agree to his deposition. But Richard, assisted by Buckingham, had shown himself to be ruthless. His execution of Hastings and others had clearly demonstrated that, and what would prevent him from eliminating still more who stood in his way? It was agreed that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would become the new king. Royal documents that were passed now no longer bore the name of Edward V, but instead read Richard III. In readiness for his coronation, Richard assembled a small army and brought them to London. He knew full well that there would be those outraged at what had transpired in the few short months between the death of Edward IV on the 9th of April until Richard III's eventual coronation in the first week of July. The day before Richard's coronation, he set out from the Tower of London. What was he thinking? How did he feel? Did he perhaps glance back at the Tower as he began the procession to Westminster? Dominic Mancini noted that Edward V and his brother were seen less and less throughout the summer until the autumn of 1483, implying that they were still alive at the time of their uncle's coronation. If they were still indeed alive at that time, then Edward and his brother would have heard all the commotion as thousands lined the streets of London. For them, this would have been a hugely traumatic moment. A coronation that should have been Edward's, with his brother playing a prominent role, had been denied them, and instead they were now waiting for death. Richard III was crowned on the 6th of July 1483 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bourchier, who was described by Dominic Mancini as being unwilling. If indeed Bourchier was unwilling, then his sentiments would have been shared far and wide. The English summer of 1483 was, as I mentioned at the beginning, an uneasy period for the English nation, and Richard III himself would have shared in that unease. Whether he genuinely believed his case for having himself crowned king was just or otherwise, he knew his actions would have made him a great deal of enemies. A usurper sits uneasy on the throne, and English history had shown several times before that taking a crown that wasn't rightfully yours would bring about its own punishment. In our next video, we'll look at Richard III's unhappy and short reign.